Chapter 3. When George Duroy found himself in the street, he hesitated as to what he should do. He wanted to run, to dream, to walk about thinking of the future as he breathed the soft night air, but the thought of the series of articles asked for by Daddy Walter haunted him, and he decided to go home at once and set to work. He walked along quickly, reached the outer boulevards, and followed their line as far as the Rue Bersault, where he dwelt. The house, 6 stories high, was inhabited by a score of small households, tradespeople or workmen, and he experienced a sickening sensation of disgust, a longing to leave the place and live like well-to-do people in a clean dwelling. As he ascended the stairs, lighting himself with wax matches on his way up the dirty steps, littered with bits of paper, cigarette ends, and scraps of kitchen refuse. A stagnant stench of cooking, cesspools and humanity, a close smell of dirt and old walls, which no rush of air could have driven out of the building, filled it from top to bottom. The young fellow's room, on the 5th floor, looked into a kind of abyss, the huge cutting of the Western Railway just above the outlet by the tunnel of the Batignolles station. Duroy opened his window and leaned against the rusty iron crossbar. Below him, at the bottom of the dark hole, 3 motionless red lights resembled the eyes of huge wild animals, and further on a glimpse could be caught of others, and others again still further. Every moment whistles, prolonged or brief, pierced the silence of the night, some near at hand, others scarcely discernible, coming from a distance from the direction of Asnières. Their modulations were akin to those of the human voice. One of them came nearer and nearer, with its plaintive appeal growing louder and louder every moment, and soon a big yellow light appeared advancing with a loud noise, and Duroy watched the string of railway carriages swallowed up by the tunnel. Then he said to himself, "Come, let's go to work." He placed his light upon the table, but at the moment of commencing he found that he had only a quire of letter paper in the place. More the pity, but he would make use of it by opening out each sheet to its full extent. He dipped his pen in ink, and wrote at the head of the page, in his best hand, "Recollections of a chasseur d'Afrique." Then he tried to frame the opening sentence. He remained with his head on his hands and his eyes fixed on the white sheet spread out before him. What should he say? He could no longer recall anything of what he had been relating a little while back, not an anecdote, not a fact, nothing. All at once the thought struck him. I must begin with my departure. And he wrote. It was in 1874, about the middle of May, when France, in her exhaustion, was reposing after the catastrophe of the terrible year. He stopped short, not knowing how to lead up to what should follow, his embarkation, his voyage, his first impressions. After 10 minutes' reflection, he resolved to put off the introductory slip till tomorrow, and to set to work at once to describe Algiers. And he traced on his paper the words, "Algiers is a white city," without being able to state anything further. He recalled in his mind the pretty white city flowing down in a cascade of flat-roofed dwellings from the summit of its hills to the sea, but he could no longer find a word to express what he had seen and felt. After a violent effort, he added, "It is partly inhabited by Arabs." Then he threw down his pen and rose from his chair. On his little iron bedstead, hollowed in the center by the pressure of his body, he saw his everyday garments cast down there, empty, worn, limp, ugly as the clothing at the morgue. On a straw-bottomed chair, his tall hat, his only one, brim uppermost, seemed to be awaiting an alms. The wallpaper, grey with blue bouquets, showed as many stains as flowers, old suspicious-looking stains, the origin of which could not be defined, crushed insects or drops of oil, finger-tips smeared with pomatum or soapy water scattered while washing. It smacked of shabby, genteel poverty, the poverty of a Paris lodging-house. Anger rose within him at the wretchedness of his mode of living. He said to himself that he must get out of it at once, that he must finish with this irksome existence the very next day. A frantic desire of working having suddenly seized on him again, he sat down once more at the table, and began anew to seek for phrases to describe the strange and charming physiognomy of Algiers, that ante-room of vast and mysterious Africa, the Africa of wandering Arabs and unknown tribes of Negroes, that unexplored Africa of which we are sometimes shown in public gardens, the improbable-looking animals seemingly made to figure in fairy tales, the ostriches, those exaggerated fowls, the gazelles, those divine goats, the surprising and grotesque giraffes, the grave-looking camels, the monstrous hippopotami, the shapeless rhinoceri, and the gorillas, those frightful-looking brothers of mankind. He vaguely felt ideas occurring to him, he might perhaps have uttered them, but he could not put them into writing. And his impotence exasperated him. He got up again, his hands damp with perspiration, and his temples throbbing. His eyes falling on his washing bill, brought up that evening by the concierge, he was suddenly seized with wild despair. All his joy vanishing in a twinkling, with his confidence in himself and his faith in the future. It was all up, he could not do anything, he would never be anybody, he felt played out, incapable, good for nothing, damned. And he went and leaned out of the window again, just as a train issued from the tunnel with a loud and violent noise. It was going away, afar off, across the fields and plains towards the sea. And the recollection of his parents stirred in Duroy's breast. It would pass near them, that train, within a few leagues of their house. He saw it again, the little house at the entrance to the village of Canteleu, on the summit of the slope overlooking Rouen and the immense valley of the Seine. His father and mother kept a little inn, a place where the tradesfolk of the suburbs of Rouen came out to lunch on Sunday at the sign of the Bellevue. They had wanted to make a gentleman of their son, and had sent him to college. Having finished his studies, and been ploughed for his bachelor's degree, he had entered on his military service with the intention of becoming an officer, a colonel, a general. But, disgusted with military life long before the completion of his 5 years' term of service, he had dreamed of making a fortune at Paris. He came there at the expiration of his term of service, despite the entreaties of his father and mother, whose visions having evaporated, wanted now to have him at home with them. In his turn he hoped to achieve a future, he foresaw a triumph by means as yet vaguely defined in his mind, but which he felt sure he could scheme out and further. He had had some successful love affairs in the regiment, some easy conquests, and even some adventures in a better class of society, having seduced a tax collector's daughter, who wanted to leave her home for his sake, and a lawyer's wife, who had tried to drown herself in despair at being abandoned. His comrades used to say of him, "He is a sharp fellow, a deep one to get out of a scrape, a chap who knows which side his bread is buttered," and he had promised himself to act up to this character. His conscience, Norman by birth, worn by the daily dealings of garrison life, rendered elastic by the examples of pillaging in Africa, illicit commissions, shaky dodgers, spurred, too, by the notions of honor current in the army, military bravados, patriotic sentiments, the fine-sounding tales current among sub-officers, and the vain glory of the profession of arms, had become a kind of box of tricks in which something of everything was to be found. But the wish to succeed reigned sovereign in it. He had, without noticing it, began to dream again as he did every evening. He pictured to himself some splendid love adventure which should bring about all at once the realization of his hopes. He married the daughter of some banker or nobleman met with in the street, and captivated at the first glance. The shrill whistle of a locomotive which, issuing from the tunnel like a big rabbit bolting out of its hole, and tearing at full speed along the rails towards the machine shed where it was to take its rest, awoke him from his dream. Then, repossessed by the vague and joyful hope which ever haunted his mind, he wafted a kiss into the night, a kiss of love addressed to the vision of the woman he was awaiting, a kiss of desire addressed to the fortune he coveted. Then he closed his window and began to undress, murmuring, "I shall feel in a better mood for it tomorrow." My thoughts are not clear tonight. Perhaps, too, I have had just a little too much to drink. One can't work well under those circumstances. He got into bed, blew out his light, and went off to sleep almost immediately. He awoke early, as one awakes on mornings of hope and trouble, and jumping out of bed, opened his window to drink a cup of fresh air, as he phrased it. The houses of the Rue de Rome opposite, on the other side of the broad railway cutting, glittering in the rays of the rising sun, seemed to be painted with white light. Afar off on the right a glimpse was caught of the slopes of Argenteuil, the hills of Sanois, and the windmills of Orgemont through a light bluish mist, like a floating and transparent veil cast onto the horizon. Duroy remained for some minutes gazing at the distant countryside, and he murmured, "It would be devilish nice out there a day like this." Then he bethought himself that he must set to work, and that at once, and also send his concierge's lad, at a cost of 10 sous, to the office to say that he was ill. He sat down at his table, dipped his pen in the ink, leaned his forehead on his hand, and sought for ideas. All in vain, nothing came. He was not discouraged, however. He thought, "Bah! I am not accustomed to it." It is a trade to be learned like all other trades. I must have some help the first time. I will go and find Forestier, who will give me a start for my article in 10 minutes. And he dressed himself. When he got into the street he came to the conclusion that it was still too early to present himself at the residence of his friend, who must be a late sleeper. He therefore walked slowly along beneath the trees of the outer boulevards. It was not yet 9 o'clock when he reached the Parc Monceau, fresh from its morning watering. Sitting down upon a bench he began to dream again. A well-dressed young man was walking up and down at a short distance, awaiting a woman, no doubt. Yes, she appeared, close-veiled and quick-stepping, and taking his arm, after a brief clasp of the hand, they walked away together. A riotous need of love broke out in Duroy's heart, a need of amours at once distinguished and delicate. He rose and resumed his journey, thinking of Forestier. What luck the fellow had. He reached the door at the moment his friend was coming out of it. You here at this time of day. What do you want of me? Juroy, taken aback at meeting him thus, just as he was starting off, stammered. You see, I can't manage to write my article, you know the article Monsieur Walter asked me to write on Algeria. It is not very surprising, considering that I have never written anything. Practice is needed for that, as for everything else. I shall get used to it very quickly, I am sure, but I do not know how to set about beginning. I have plenty of ideas, but I cannot manage to express them. He stopped, hesitatingly, and Forestier smiled somewhat slyly, saying, I know what it is. Juroy went on, yes, it must happen to everyone at the beginning. Well, I came to ask you for a lift. In 10 minutes you can give me a start, you can show me how to shape it. It will be a good lesson in style you will give me, and really without you I do not see how I can get on with it. Forestier still smiled, and tapping his old comrade on the arm, said, Go in and see my wife, she will settle your business quite as well as I could. I have trained her for that kind of work. I, myself, have not time this morning, or I would willingly have done it for you. Juroy suddenly abashed, hesitated, feeling afraid. But I cannot call on her at this time of the day. Oh, yes, she is up. You will find her in my study arranging some notes for me. Juroy refused to go upstairs, saying, No, I can't think of such a thing. Forestier took him by the shoulders, twisted him round on his heels, and pushing him towards the staircase, said, Go along, you great donkey, when I tell you to. You are not going to oblige me to go up these flights of stairs again to introduce you and explain the fix you are in. Then Juroy made up his mind. "Thanks, then, I will go up," he said. "I shall tell her that you forced me, positively forced me to come and see her." "All right. She won't scratch your eyes out." "Above all, do not forget our appointment for 3 o'clock. "Oh, don't be afraid about that." Forestier hastened off, and Duroy began to ascend the stairs slowly, step by step, thinking over what he should say, and feeling uneasy as to his probable reception. The manservant, wearing a blue apron, and holding a broom in his hand, opened the door to him. "Master is not at home," he said, without waiting to be spoken to. Duroy persisted. "Ask Madame Forestier," said he, "whether she will receive me, and tell her that I have come from her husband, whom I met in the street." Then he waited while the man went away, returned, and opening the door on the right, said, "Madame will see you, sir." She was seated in an office armchair in a small room, the walls of which were wholly hidden by books carefully ranged on shelves of black wood. The bindings, of various tints red, yellow, green, violet, and blue, gave some color and liveliness to those monotonous lines of volumes. She turned round, still smiling. She was wrapped in a white dressing gown, trimmed with lace, and as she held out her hand, displayed her bare arm in its wide sleeve. "Already?" said she, and then added, "That is not meant for a reproach, but a simple question." "Oh, madam, I did not want to come up, but your husband, whom I met at the bottom of the house, obliged me to." "I am so confused that I dare not tell you what brings me." She pointed to a chair, saying, "Sit down and tell me about it." She was twirling a goose quill between her fingers, and in front of her was a half-written page, interrupted by the young fellow's arrival. She seemed quite at home at this work table, as much at her ease as if in her drawing room, engaged on everyday tasks. A faint perfume emanated from her dressing gown, the fresh perfume of a recent toilet. Duroy sought to divine, fancied he could trace, the outline of her plump, youthful figure through the soft material enveloping it. She went on, as he did not reply, "Well, come tell me what is it?" He murmured, hesitatingly, "Well, you see, but I really dare not. I was working last night very late and quite early this morning on the article upon Algeria, upon which Monsieur Walter asked me to write, and I could not get on with it. I tore up all my attempts." "I am not accustomed to this kind of work, and I came to ask Forestier to help me this once." She interrupted him, laughing heartily. "And he told you to come and see me?" "That is a nice thing." "Yes, madam. He said that you will get me out of my difficulty better than himself, but I did not dare, I did not wish to, you understand." She rose, saying, "It will be delightful to work in collaboration with you like that." "I am charmed at the notion." "Come, sit down in my place, for they know my handwriting at the office." "And we will knock you off an article, oh, but a good one." He sat down, took a pen, spread a sheet of paper before him, and waited. Madame Forestier, standing by, watched him make these preparations, then took a cigarette from the mantel shelf, and lit it. "I cannot work without smoking," said she. "Come, what are you going to say?" He lifted his head towards her with astonishment. "But that is just what I don't know, since it is that I came to see you about." She replied, "Oh, I will put it in order for you." "I will make the sauce, but then I want the materials of the dish." He remained embarrassed before her. At length he said, hesitatingly, "I should like to relate my journey, then, from the beginning." Then she sat down before him on the other side of the table, and looking him in the eyes. "Well, tell it me first, for myself alone, you understand, slowly and without forgetting anything, and I will select what is to be used of it." But as he did not know where to commence, she began to question him as a priest would have done in the confessional, putting precise questions which recalled to him forgotten details, people encountered and faces merely caught sight of. When she had made him speak thus for about a quarter of an hour, she suddenly interrupted him with, "Now we will begin." In the first place, we will imagine that you are narrating your impressions to a friend, which will allow you to write a lot of tomfoolery, to make remarks of all kinds, to be natural and funny if we can. Begin. My dear Henry, you want to know what Algeria is like, and you shall. I will send you, having nothing else to do, in a little cabin of dried mud which serves me as a habitation, a kind of journal of my life, day by day, and hour by hour. It will be a little lively at times, more is the pity, but you are not obliged to show it to your lady friends. She paused to relight her cigarette, which had gone out, and the faint creaking of the quill on the paper stopped, too. "Let us continue," said she. Algeria is a great French country on the frontiers of the great unknown countries called the Desert, the Sahara, Central Africa, etc., etc. Algiers is the door, the pretty white door of this strange continent. But it is first necessary to get to it, which is not a rosy job for everyone. I am, you know, an excellent horseman, since I break in the colonel's horses, but a man may be a very good rider and a very bad sailor. That is my case. You remember Surgeon Major Simbretres, whom we used to call Old Ipecacuana, and how, when we thought ourselves ripe for a 24 hours stay in the infirmary, that blessed sojourning place, we used to go up before him. How he used to sit in his chair, with his fat legs in his red trousers, wide apart, his hands on his knees, and his elbows stuck, rolling his great eyes and gnawing his white moustache. You remember his favorite mode of treatment: "This man's stomach is out of order. Give him a dose of emetic number 3, according to my prescription, and then 12 hours off duty, and he will be all right." It was a sovereign remedy, that emetic, sovereign and irresistible. One swallowed it because one had to. Then when one had undergone the effects of old Ipecacuana's prescription, one enjoyed 12 well-earned hours rest. Well, my dear fellow, to reach Africa, it is necessary to undergo for 40 hours the effects of another kind of irresistible emetic, according to the prescription of the Compagnie Transatlantique. She rubbed her hands, delighted with the idea. She got up and walked about, after having lit another cigarette, and dictated as she puffed out little whiffs of smoke, which, issuing at first through a little round hole in the midst of her compressed lips, slowly evaporated, leaving in the air faint grey lines, a kind of transparent mist, like a spider's web. Sometimes with her open hand she would brush these light traces aside, at others she would cut them asunder with her forefinger, and then watch with serious attention the two halves of the almost impenetrable vapor slowly disappear. Duroy, with his eyes, followed all her gestures, her attitudes, the movements of her form and features, busied with this vague pastime which did not preoccupy her thoughts. She now imagined the incidents of the journey, sketched traveling companions invented by herself, and a love affair with the wife of a captain of infantry on her way to join her husband. Then, sitting down again, she questioned Duroy on the topography of Algeria, of which she was absolutely ignorant. In 10 minutes she knew as much about it as he did, and she dictated a little chapter of political and colonial geography to coach the reader up in such matters and prepare him to understand the serious questions which were to be brought forward in the following articles. She continued by a trip into the provinces of Oran, a fantastic trip, in which it was, above all, a question of women, Moorish, Jewish, and Spanish. " That is what interests most," she said. She wound up by a sojourn at Ceuta, at the foot of the Great Tablelands, and by a pretty little intrigue between the sub-officer, George Duroy, and a Spanish workgirl employed at the Alpha factory at An el Hadja. She described their rendezvous at night amidst the bare, stony hills, with jackals, hyenas, and Arab dogs yelling, barking and howling among the rocks. And she gleefully uttered the words, "To be continued." Then rising, she added, "That is how one writes an article, my dear sir." "Sign it, if you please." He hesitated. "But sign it, I tell you." Then he began to laugh, and wrote at the bottom of the page, "George Duroy." She went on smoking as she walked up and down, and he still kept looking at her, unable to find anything to say to thank her, happy to be with her, filled with gratitude, and with the sensual pleasure of this newborn intimacy. It seemed to him that everything surrounding him was part of her, everything down to the walls covered with books. The chairs, the furniture, the air in which the perfume of tobacco was floating, had something special, nice, sweet, and charming, which emanated from her. Suddenly she asked, "What do you think of my friend, Madame de Morel?" He was surprised, and answered, I think her very charming." "Is it not so?" "Yes, certainly." He longed to add, "But not so much as yourself," but dared not. She resumed, "And if you only knew how funny, original, and intelligent she is." "She is a bohemian, a true bohemian." "That is why her husband scarcely cares for her." "He only sees her defects, and does not appreciate her good qualities." Duroy felt stupefied at learning that Madame de Morel was married, and yet it was only natural that she should be. He said, "Oh, she is married, then." "And what is her husband?" Madame Forestier gently shrugged her shoulders, and raised her eyebrows, with a gesture of incomprehensible meaning. "Oh, he is an inspector on the Northern Railway." "He spends 8 days out of the month in Paris." "What his wife calls obligatory service, or weekly duty, or Holy Week." "When you know her better you will see how nice and bright she is." "Go and call on her one of these days." Duroy no longer thought of leaving. It seemed to him that he was going to stop forever, that he was at home. But the door opened noiselessly, and a tall gentleman entered without being announced. He stopped short on seeing a stranger. Madame Forestier seemed troubled for a moment, then she said in natural tones, though a slight rosy flush had risen to her cheeks. "Come in, my dear sir. I must introduce one of Charles's old friends, Monsieur Georges Duroy, a future journalist." Then in another tone, she added, "Our best and most intimate friend, the Count de Vaudrec." The two men bowed, looking each other in the eyes, and Duroy at once took his leave. There was no attempt to detain him. He stammered a few thanks, grasped the outstretched hand of Madame Forestier, bowed again to the newcomer, who preserved the cold, grave air of a man of position, and went out quite disturbed, as if he had made a fool of himself. On finding himself once more in the street, he felt sad and uneasy, haunted by the vague idea of some hidden vexation. He walked on, asking himself whence came this sudden melancholy. He could not tell, but the stern face of the Count de Vaudrec, already somewhat aged, with grey hair, and the calmly insolent look of a very wealthy man, constantly recurred to his recollection. He noted that the arrival of this unknown, breaking off a charming tête-à-tête, had produced in him that chilly, despairing sensation that a word overheard, a trifle noticed, the least thing suffices sometimes to bring about. It seemed to him, too, that this man, without his being able to guess why, had been displeased at finding him there. He had nothing more to do till 3 o'clock, and it was not yet noon. He had still 6 francs 50 centimes in his pocket, and he went and lunched at a Bouillon Duval. Then he prowled about the boulevard, and as 3 o'clock struck, ascended the staircase, in itself an advertisement, of the Vie Française. The messengers in waiting were seated with folded arms on a bench, while at a kind of desk a doorkeeper was sorting the correspondence that had just arrived. The entire get-up of the place, intended to impress visitors, was perfect. Everyone had the appearance, bearing, dignity, and smartness suitable to the ante-room of a large newspaper. "Monsieur Walter, if you please," inquired Duroy. "The manager is engaged, sir," replied the doorkeeper. "Will you take a seat, sir?" and he indicated the waiting room, already full of people. There were men grave, important-looking, and decorated, and men without visible linen, whose frock-coats, buttoned up to the chin, bore upon the breast stains recalling the outlines of continents and seas on geographical maps. There were 3 women among them. One of them was pretty, smiling, and decked out, and had the air of a gay woman. Her neighbor, with a wrinkled, tragic countenance, decked out also, but in more severe fashion, had about her something worn and artificial which old actresses generally have, a kind of false youth, like a scent of stale love. The third woman, in mourning, sat in a corner, with the air of a desolate widow. Duroy thought that she had come to ask for charity. However, no one was ushered into the room beyond, and more than 20 minutes had elapsed. Duroy was seized with an idea, and going back to the doorkeeper, said, "Monsieur Walter made an appointment for me to call on him here at 3 o'clock. At all events, see whether my friend, Monsieur Forestier, is here." He was at once ushered along a lengthy passage, which brought him to a large room where 4 gentlemen were writing at a large green-covered table. Forestier, standing before the fireplace, was smoking a cigarette and playing at cup and ball. He was very clever at this, and kept spiking the huge ball of yellow boxwood on the wooden point. He was counting 22, 23, 24, 25. "26," said Duroy. His friend raised his eyes without interrupting the regular movement of his arm, saying, "Oh, here you are, then." "Yesterday I landed the ball 57 times right off." "There is only Saint Potin who can beat me at it among those here." "Have you seen the governor?" "There is nothing funnier than to see that old tubby Norbit playing at cup and ball." He opens his mouth as if he was going to swallow the ball every time. One of the others turned round towards him, saying, "I say, Forestier, I know of one for sale, a beauty in West Indian wood, it is said to have belonged to the Queen of Spain." "They want 60 francs for it." "Not dear." Forestier asked, "Where does it hang out?" And as he had missed his 37th shot, he opened a cupboard in which Duroy saw a score of magnificent cups and balls, arranged and numbered like a collection of art objects. Then, having put back the one he had been using in its usual place, he repeated, "Where does this gem hang out?" The journalist replied, "At a box office keepers of the vaudeville." "I will bring it you tomorrow, if you like." "All right. If it is really a good one I will take it, one can never have too many." Then turning to Duroy he added, "Come with me. I will take you in to see the governor, otherwise you might be getting moldy here till 7 in the evening." They recrossed the waiting room, in which the same people were waiting in the same order. As soon as Forestier appeared, the young woman and the old actress, rising quickly, came up to him. He took them aside one after the other into the bay of the window, and although they took care to talk in low tones, Duroy noticed that they were on familiar terms. Then, having passed through 2 padded doors, they entered the manager's room. The conference, which had been going on for an hour or so, was nothing more than a game at écarté with some of the gentlemen with the flat-brimmed hats whom Duroy had noticed the night before. Monsieur Walter dealt and played with concentrated attention and crafty movements, while his adversary threw down, picked up, and handled the light bits of colored pasteboard with the swiftness, skill, and grace of a practiced player. Norbert de Varenne, seated in the managerial armchair, was writing an article. Jacques Rival, stretched at full length on a couch, was smoking a cigar with his eyes closed. The room smelled close, with that blended odor of leather-covered furniture, stale tobacco, and printing ink peculiar to editors' rooms and familiar to all journalists. Upon the black wood table, inlaid with brass, lay an incredible pile of papers, letters, cards, newspapers, magazines, bills, and printed matter of every description. Forestier shook hands with the punters standing behind the card players, and without saying a word watched the progress of the game. Then, as soon as Daddy Walter had won, he said, "Here is my friend, Juroy." The manager glanced sharply at the young fellow over the glasses of his spectacles, and said, "Have you brought my article?" It would go very well today with the Morel debate. Juroy took the sheets of paper folded in four from his pocket, saying, "Here it is, sir." The manager seemed pleased, and remarked, with a smile, "Very good, very good." "You are a man of your word. You must look through this for me, Forestier." But Forestier hastened to reply, "It is not worthwhile, Monsieur Walter." "I did it with him to give him a lesson in the tricks of the trade." "It is very well done." And the manager, who was gathering up the cards dealt by a tall, thin gentleman, a deputy belonging to the left center, remarked with indifference, "All right, then." Forestier, however, did not let him begin the new game, but stooping, murmured in his ear, "You know you promised me to take on Juroy to replace Marambot." "Shall I engage him on the same terms?" "Yes, certainly." Taking his friend's arm, the journalist led him away, while Monsieur Walter resumed the game. Norbert de Varenne had not lifted his head, he did not appear to have seen or recognized Juroy. Jacques Rival, on the contrary, had taken his hand with the marked and demonstrative energy of a comrade who may be reckoned upon in the case of any little difficulty. They passed through the waiting room again, and as everyone looked at them, Forestier said to the youngest of the women, in a tone loud enough to be heard by the rest, "The manager will see you directly." He is just now engaged with 2 members of the Budget Committee. Then he passed swiftly on, with an air of hurry and importance, as though about to draft at once an article of the utmost weight. As soon as they were back in the reporter's room, Forestier at once took up his cup and ball, and as he began to play with it again, said to Duroy, breaking his sentences in order to count, "You will come here every day at 3 o'clock, and I will tell you the places you are to go to, either during the day or in the evening, or the next morning. 1. I will give you, first of all, a letter of introduction to the head of the first department of the Prefecture of Police, 2, who will put you in communication with one of his clerks. You will settle with him about all the important information. 3, from the prefecture, official and quasi-official information, you know. In all matters of detail you will apply to St. Potin, who is up in the work. 4, you can see him by and by, or tomorrow. You must, above all, cultivate the knack of dragging information out of men I send you to see. 5, and to get in everywhere, in spite of closed doors. 6, you will have for this a salary of 200 francs a month, with 2 sous a line for the paragraphs you glean. 7, and 2 sous a line for all articles written by you to order on different subjects. 8. Then he gave himself up entirely to his occupation, and went on slowly counting, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He missed the 14th, and swore, "Damn that 13, it always brings me bad luck." I shall die on the 13th of some month, I am certain. One of his colleagues who had finished his work also took a cup and ball from the cupboard. He was a little man, who looked like a boy, although he was really 35. Several other journalists having come in, went one after the other and got out the toy belonging to each of them. Soon there were 6 standing side by side, with their backs to the wall, swinging into the air, with even and regular motion, the balls of red, yellow, and black, according to the wood they were made of. And a match having begun, the 2 who were still working got up to act as umpires. Forestier won by 11 points. Then the little man, with the juvenile aspect, who had lost, rang for the messenger, and gave the order, 9 box. And they began to play again pending the arrival of these refreshments. Duroy drank a glass of beer with his new comrades, and then said to his friend, "What am I to do now? I have nothing for you today. You can go if you want to." An article, will it go in tonight? Yes, but do not bother yourself about it, I will correct the proofs. Write the continuation for tomorrow, and come here at 3 o'clock, the same as today. Duroy, having shaken hands with everyone, without even knowing their names, went down the magnificent staircase with a light heart and high spirits.